The wind carried whispers of laughter as Winifred Kennedy limped down the dusty main street of Promise Creek, Montana, in the summer of 1879. At 24, she had learned to tilt her chin upward against the sidelong glances, but today, the weight of those stares felt heavier than the scorching July sun beating down on her calico bonnet. The newly constructed town hall loomed ahead, its freshly painted white exterior a stark contrast to the weathered wooden buildings that populated the rest of Promise Creek. Flags and bunting decorated the entrance, and the sounds of fiddles being tuned drifted through the open windows. The annual Founders' Day dance was the social event of the season, drawing folks from miles around to celebrate the town's establishment 12 years prior. Winifred adjusted her grip on her basket of baked goods. The apple pies inside were her contribution to the celebration, a peace offering of sorts to a community that had never quite accepted her. She'd arrived in Promise Creek 3 years ago, following the death of her parents, to live with her Aunt Martha. The childhood fever that had left her with a twisted leg and awkward gait had also made her an immediate outsider. "Look, who's decided to grace us with her presence." Prudence Miller's voice carried deliberately loud from the general store porch, where she sat with several other women. "I wonder if she thinks someone might actually dance with her tonight." Laughter rippled through the small gathering, sharp as a knife. Winifred kept her eyes forward, pretending not to hear. The wooden boardwalk creaked beneath her uneven steps as she approached the town hall. The smell of fresh baked pies from her basket mingled with the scent of sawdust and varnish from the newly constructed building. Inside, women bustled about, arranging tables with white cloths and wildflower centerpieces. Mrs. Tilson, the mayor's wife, directed the proceedings with military precision. She looked up as Winifred entered, her smile faltering momentarily. "Winifred, dear, how thoughtful of you to bring something." Her eyes darted to the basket. "You can set those pies with the other desserts." She gestured vaguely toward a table at the far end of the hall, before turning away to address a more pressing concern about the placement of chairs. Winifred made her way across the polished wooden floor, conscious of each uneven step. She placed her pies among the growing collection of desserts, arranging them carefully so the decorative lattice tops were displayed to their best advantage. "Those look mighty fine." The deep voice startled her. Winifred turned to find herself looking up at a stranger, a tall man with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of a summer storm. He wasn't from Promise Creek. She would have remembered him. "Thank you," she replied, smoothing her apron nervously. "Apple, with cinnamon and a touch of nutmeg." "My favorite." The man smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling pleasantly. His dark hair was neatly combed back, though a rebellious strand fell across his forehead. Unlike most men in town, he wasn't dressed in his Sunday best for the dance, but rather in trail-worn clothes, denim pants, a blue cotton shirt rolled at the sleeves, and a leather vest. A dusty cowboy hat hung from his fingers. "I don't believe we've met," Winifred said, curiosity overcoming her usual reticence with strangers. "I'm Winifred Kennedy." "Xavier Blackwell," he replied, extending a hand. "Most folks just call me Zav." Winifred hesitated before placing her hand in his. His palm was rough with calluses, his grip firm but gentle. "You're new to Promise Creek." "Just passing through," he explained. "Got hired to deliver some horses to the Peterson ranch." "Mr. Peterson mentioned there was a dance tonight and suggested I might enjoy it before heading back out tomorrow." "I see." Winifred withdrew her hand, suddenly conscious of how rough her own palms were from cooking and helping her aunt with the laundry business. "Well, I hope you enjoy your evening, Mr. Blackwell." "Xavier," he corrected with a smile. "Or Zav," And I suspect I will, especially if I get to sample one of those pies." Winifred couldn't help but return his smile. There was something disarming about his easy manner, so different from the careful politeness that most strangers adopted when they first noticed her limp. The doors of the town hall swung open, and a group of cowboys from the surrounding ranches sauntered in, bringing with them the scent of horses, leather, and trail dust. Xavier nodded toward them. "Seems like the celebration is about to begin in earnest. Perhaps I'll see you later, Miss Kennedy." Before Winifred could respond, he tipped his hat and moved away, blending into the growing crowd. She watched him go, puzzled by the brief interaction. Most men in Promise Creek barely acknowledged her existence, let alone engaged her in conversation. As the afternoon progressed into evening, the town hall filled with people. Lanterns were lit, casting a warm glow over the proceedings. The town's small band, consisting of 2 fiddlers, a banjo player, and an enthusiastic, if not particularly talented pianist, set up in the corner and began to play a lively tune. Winifred found a seat along the wall, next to her Aunt Martha, a stern-faced woman whose hard life had left little room for sentimentality. Martha had taken Winifred in out of familial duty rather than affection, and while she wasn't unkind, there was a distance between them that 3 years of shared living hadn't bridged. "Your pies seem popular," Martha noted, watching as slices were distributed among the partygoers. Though Mrs. Miller is telling everyone that her peach cobbler is the talk of the evening, Winifred smiled faintly. "Mrs. Miller's cobbler is always excellent. HMPH. Martha sniffed, clearly disagreeing but too polite to say so openly. "You should mingle, Winifred. You'll never find a husband sitting here with an old woman." "I'm content as I am," Winifred replied, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. The prospect of spending her life as her aunt's companion, helping with the laundry business until Martha grew too old to continue, wasn't what she had dreamed of as a girl. The music shifted to a waltz, and couples moved to the center of the room. Winifred watched as men led their wives and sweethearts onto the floor, their movements fluid and graceful. She had never danced, had never been asked, and had convinced herself long ago that she didn't mind. "Miss Kennedy." Xavier Blackwell stood before her, hat in hand, his tall frame blocking the lantern light. He nodded respectfully to Martha before returning his attention to Winifred. "I was wondering if you might honor me with this dance." Winifred stared at him, certain she had misheard. I don't dance, Mr. Blackwell." "Everyone can dance," he said, extending his hand. "It's just a matter of finding the right partner." Winifred felt the weight of eyes turning in their direction. "You don't understand," she said quietly. "I can't dance." "My leg makes you unique," Xavier finished for her. "Not incapable." Across the room, Prudence Miller whispered something to her companions and a ripple of laughter followed. Winifred felt her cheeks burn. "They're laughing," she said softly. Xavier's gaze never wavered from her face. "Let them. I'm still waiting for an answer, Miss Kennedy." Martha nudged her gently. "Go on, girl. Don't keep the gentleman waiting." Winifred hesitated a moment longer before placing her hand in his. "Very well, Mr. Blackwell, but don't say I didn't warn you." Xavier led her to the edge of the dance floor, away from the center where most couples twirled. He positioned himself carefully, one hand at her waist, the other holding hers. "Follow my lead," he said quietly. "We'll start slow." The music surrounded them as Xavier guided her in a simplified version of the waltz. He matched his steps to her uneven gait, creating a rhythm that worked with her limitations rather than against them. Winifred concentrated on his movements, her initial stiffness gradually giving way to something approaching grace. "You're doing wonderfully," Xavier encouraged as they completed a turn. Winifred dared to look up from watching their feet. Only because you're making it easy. That's what a good partner does. His smile was warm, his eyes never straying to her leg or to the onlookers who had stopped to watch the unusual pair. As they continued to dance, Winifred became aware of the whispers and stares. Some faces showed surprise, others amusement, and a few like Prudence Miller open derision. But for the first time, Winifred found she didn't care. The feeling of moving to the music, of being held respectfully by a handsome man who saw beyond her disability, was worth every sidelong glance. When the music finally ended, Xavier stepped back and bowed slightly. "Thank you for the dance, Miss Kennedy." "Thank you," she replied, breathless from more than just exertion. "That was unexpected. The night is full of surprises," he said cryptically, "and it's only just begun." Before she could ask what he meant, the band struck up another tune and Xavier was leading her back to her seat. As they walked, the crowd parted, some nodding in acknowledgement, others turning away quickly. Winifred held her head high, Xavier's presence beside her a shield against their judgment. "You've caused quite a stir," Martha observed as Winifred sat down. "Mrs. Miller looks like she swallowed a lemon." Xavier chuckled. "I hope you don't mind, madam, but I'd like to borrow your niece for a bit longer. I hear there's a fine view of the stars from the town hall steps, and I could use some fresh air." Martha's eyebrows rose, but she nodded. "Just remember, Mr. Blackwell, that in Promise Creek, reputations are as fragile as eggshells." "I'll treat Miss Kennedy's with the utmost care," he promised solemnly. Outside, the night air was cool and sweet with the scent of prairie grass. Lanterns illuminated the town hall steps, but beyond their glow, the vast Montana sky stretched overhead, studded with stars that seemed close enough to touch. Winifred settled on the top step, arranging her skirts carefully. Xavier sat beside her, his long legs stretched out before him. "You're very kind, Mr. Blackwell," she said after a moment of companionable silence. "But you needn't feel obligated to spend your evening with me out of pity." Xavier turned to look at her, his expression serious. "Is that what you think this is? Pity? What else could it be?" Winifred gestured to her leg. "No one in Promise Creek has ever shown interest in dancing with the crippled laundress's niece." "Then the men of Promise Creek are fools," Xavier said firmly. "And my name is Xavier, remember. Mr. Blackwell was my father, and he was a much more serious man than I'll ever be." Winifred smiled despite herself. "Xavier, then, though I still don't understand why you singled me out tonight." He looked up at the stars, seemingly gathering his thoughts. "When I rode into town this afternoon, I stopped at the mercantile for supplies. I overheard some women talking gossiping, really about various townspeople. Your name came up." Winifred stiffened. "I see." "No, I don't think you do." Xavier turned to face her fully. "They mentioned your skill with baking, your dedication to helping your aunt, your kindness to the Sullivan children when their mother was ill last winter. They also mentioned your limp, as if it somehow negated all those other qualities." He shook his head, a flash of anger crossing his features. "It made me curious about this Winifred Kennedy, who was defined by something so superficial in the eyes of her neighbors. And then, I saw you in the town hall, arranging those pies so carefully, and there was such grace in your movements, such attention to detail." Winifred looked down, overwhelmed by his words. "You saw me before I saw you." "I did." Xavier's voice softened. "And I wanted to know you better from that moment. The dance was just an excuse to spend time with you." "You're leaving tomorrow," Winifred reminded him, protecting herself from the dangerous hope his words ignited. "That was the plan," he acknowledged. "But plans can change." The door of the town hall opened, spilling light and music onto the steps. A group of young men emerged, laughing and passing a flask between them. They fell silent when they spotted Xavier and Winifred. "Evening," one of them called, a note of challenge in his voice. Winifred recognized him as Thomas Reed, the blacksmith's son and one of Prudence Miller's most devoted admirers. Xavier nodded politely. "Gentlemen." "You're the horse trader," Thomas said, stepping closer, "the one who had our Winnie dancing." The familiar diminutive of her name, never used by anyone in town, sounded mocking on Thomas's lips. Winifred felt Xavier tense beside her. "Miss Kennedy was kind enough to accept my invitation," Xavier replied evenly. "We were just enjoying the night air." Thomas exchanged glances with his companions. "Well, don't let us interrupt, though I must say it's a surprise to see Winnie with a gentleman caller. Most men around here prefer a woman who can walk properly." The cruelty of the words hung in the air. Winifred felt as though she'd been slapped, though she had heard worse in the 3 years she'd lived in Promise Creek. Xavier stood slowly, his movements deliberate. Though not as broad as Thomas, he was taller, and there was a stillness about him that suggested danger. "I believe you owe Miss Kennedy an apology," he said quietly. Thomas laughed, emboldened by liquor and the presence of his friends. "For what? Speaking the truth." "Everyone knows. The only thing everyone should know," Xavier interrupted, his voice still calm but with an edge of steel, "is that Miss Kennedy is a lady deserving of respect, something you seem incapable of showing." Thomas stepped forward, fists clenched. "Who do you think you are, stranger? Coming into our town, telling us how to treat our own." "I'm a man who doesn't abide bullies," Xavier replied, "especially those who target women." Winifred rose to her feet, alarmed by the escalating tension. "Please, this isn't necessary. Xavier, let's go back inside." "Listen to your cripple," Thomas sneered, "before you get yourself hurt." Xavier moved so quickly that Thomas had no time to react. One moment he was standing on the step, the next he had Thomas by the collar, his face inches from the younger man's. "Apologize," Xavier said, his voice dangerously soft. "Now." Thomas struggled, but Xavier's grip was firm. The other young men stepped back, unwilling to involve themselves in the confrontation. "I apologize," Thomas finally muttered, his face red with humiliation. Xavier released him with a slight push. "Not to me, to Miss Kennedy." Thomas turned to Winifred, straightening his rumpled collar. "I apologize, Miss Kennedy," he said stiffly. "My remarks were inappropriate." Winifred nodded, her heart pounding. "Apology accepted, Mr. Reed." Thomas glared at Xavier before stalking off, his friends trailing behind him. The sound of their muttered curses faded as they disappeared around the corner of the building. Winifred sank back onto the step, her legs suddenly weak. "You shouldn't have done that." Xavier sat beside her, running a hand through his hair. "Maybe not, but I couldn't stand by and listen to him speak to you that way. They'll make trouble for you now," she warned. "Thomas Reed has friends in this town." "I'll be gone tomorrow," Xavier reminded her, though his words lacked conviction. Winifred looked at him, really looked at him, trying to understand this man who had waltzed into her carefully constructed life and upended it in the space of an evening. "Why do you care?" she asked finally. "About how they treat me, about any of this." Xavier was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the dark street. "I know what it's like to be judged for things beyond your control," he said finally, "to be reduced to a single trait in the eyes of others." Winifred waited, sensing there was more he wanted to say. "My mother was Cherokee," he continued. "My father was a white trader who fell in love with her despite the disapproval of both their peoples. I grew up caught between two worlds, never fully belonging to either." He turned to her, his eyes reflecting the starlight. So when I see someone being dismissed because they're different, because they don't fit neatly into what others expect, it matters to me." Winifred reached out hesitantly, touching his hand. "I'm sorry you experienced that." Xavier turned his palm up, capturing her fingers in his. "Don't be. It made me who I am, just as your experiences have shaped you." The moment stretched between them, fragile and precious. The music from inside the town hall seemed far away, belonging to another world entirely. "We should go back in," Winifred said finally. "Aunt Martha will be wondering where I am." Xavier nodded, though he made no move to release her hand. "We probably should." Instead, they remained on the steps, talking as the stars wheeled overhead. Xavier told her about his life as a horse trader, traveling throughout the Western Territories, never staying in one place for long. Winifred shared stories of her childhood in Illinois, of the fever that had damaged her leg when she was 8, of her dreams of someday opening a bakery of her own. It was well past midnight when they finally returned to the dance, only to find that many of the townspeople had already departed. Aunt Martha sat dozing in her chair, jerking awake as they approached. "There you are," she said, her tone accusatory despite the relief in her eyes. "I was beginning to think you'd run off together." "My apologies, Mrs. Kennedy," Xavier said smoothly. "I'm afraid I monopolized your niece's evening with my stories." Martha harumphed, but there was a gleam of approval in her gaze as she looked between them. "Well, it's time we were heading home. Some of us have work in the morning, even if it is Sunday." As they walked Martha home, Xavier carrying a lantern to light their way down the dark streets, Winifred found herself wondering what tomorrow would bring. Xavier would leave, returning to his life of constant movement, and she would resume her quiet existence in Promise Creek. The thought left an unexpected hollow feeling in her chest. At the door to the small house Winifred shared with her aunt, Xavier handed the lantern to Martha and asked for a moment alone with Winifred. Martha raised an eyebrow but went inside without comment. "I want to thank you for this evening," Xavier said once they were alone. "It's been a long time since I've enjoyed myself so thoroughly." "I should be thanking you," Winifred replied. "No one has ever asked me to dance before." Xavier took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "Would you think me terribly forward if I asked to call on you tomorrow before I leave?" Winifred's heart leapt. "I wouldn't think it forward at all." "Good." He smiled, releasing her hand reluctantly. "Because I find myself reluctant to say goodbye just yet." Winifred returned his smile, warmth spreading through her despite the cool night air. "Until tomorrow, then." "Until tomorrow," Xavier agreed, tipping his hat before turning to walk back toward the hotel where he was staying. Winifred watched him go, his tall figure gradually swallowed by the darkness. Only when he had disappeared completely did she enter the house, her mind already counting the hours until morning. The dawn brought with it a clear sky and the promise of another scorching July day. Winifred rose early, as was her habit, to help Aunt Martha prepare for the day. Sundays meant no laundry work, but there were still chores to be done before church services at 10 o'clock. As she pumped water to fill the kettle, Winifred found herself humming the waltz from the previous night. The memory of moving across the floor in Xavier's arms brought a smile to her face that even Aunt Martha's grumbling about the heat couldn't diminish. "You seem cheerful this morning," Martha observed as they sat down to a breakfast of cornbread and coffee. "I haven't heard you sing in a long while." Winifred ducked her head, embarrassed to be caught in her happiness. "It was a pleasant evening, Martha buttered her cornbread with deliberate care. "That Blackwell fellow seems decent enough, though there's something in his eyes that speaks of trouble." "He was nothing but respectful," Winifred defended. "I didn't say he wasn't," Martha replied. "But men who wander rarely settle, Winifred. Remember that before you give your heart away to a drifter." The warning dampened Winifred's spirits somewhat, though she tried not to let it show. Her aunt was practical to a fault, shaped by a life of hard work and disappointment. She saw danger where Winifred saw possibility. After breakfast, they walked to the small white church at the edge of town. The same people who had witnessed Winifred dancing the night before now nodded politely, as she and Martha took their usual seats near the back. If there were whispers about her interaction with the handsome stranger, they were kept discreetly low. The service seemed interminable to Winifred, whose thoughts kept straying to Xavier. Would he still want to see her in the clear light of day? Or would the morning have brought reconsideration of an impulsive invitation? Her questions were answered as they emerged from the church into the midday sun. Xavier stood across the street, leaning against a hitching post, his dark hair neatly combed and his clothes fresher than they had been the night before. When he caught sight of Winifred, he straightened and crossed the dusty road with long strides. "Miss Kennedy," he greeted her with a tip of his hat. "Mrs. Kennedy, I hope you had a restful night." "As restful as one can expect at my age," Martha replied dryly. "Are you joining us for Sunday dinner, Mr. Blackwell?" The invitation surprised Winifred, who turned to stare at her aunt. Martha was not known for her hospitality, particularly to strangers. Xavier seemed equally taken aback, but he recovered quickly. "I would be honored, madam, if it's no trouble." "It's no trouble," Martha assured him, though her tone suggested otherwise. "Winifred always cooks enough for an army, despite my reminders that it's just the two of us." They walked back to the house together, Martha leading the way with surprising speed for a woman of her years. Xavier fell into step beside Winifred, slowing his pace to accommodate her limp. "Your aunt is a formidable woman," he observed quietly. "She is that," Winifred agreed. "Though I'm surprised she invited you to dinner. She's not usually so welcoming." Xavier glanced ahead to ensure Martha was out of earshot. "I suspect she wants to interrogate me properly before I spend any more time with her niece." Winifred laughed softly. "That sounds like Aunt Martha." "Consider yourself warned, she can be quite direct." "I appreciate directness," Xavier said. "It's refreshing after dealing with people who hide their intentions." When they reached the house, Martha immediately put Xavier to work chopping wood for the stove while she and Winifred prepared the meal. From the kitchen window, Winifred watched him remove his vest and roll up his sleeves, revealing muscular forearms tanned by the sun. He handled the axe with practiced ease, the wood splitting cleanly under his powerful strokes. "He's handy, I'll give him that," Martha commented, following Winifred's gaze, "and easy on the eyes." "Aunt Martha," Winifred felt her cheeks heat with embarrassment. "Oh, don't act so scandalized. I may be old, but I'm not blind." Martha sniffed as she peeled potatoes. "The question is, what are his intentions? Men don't usually pay such attention to a woman unless they want something." "Perhaps he simply enjoys my company," Winifred suggested, though she had wondered the same thing herself. Martha gave her a look that said she found this explanation lacking. "Just be careful, girl. The world isn't kind to women who trust too easily." The dinner itself was a simple affair. Roast chicken, potatoes, and green beans from Martha's small garden, with apple pie for dessert. Xavier ate with appreciation, complimenting the food sincerely and answering Martha's increasingly direct questions about his background, his work, and his plans. "So you have no permanent home?" Martha asked as she poured coffee after the meal. Xavier accepted the cup with a nod of thanks. "Not at present. My work takes me where the horses are needed." "And where might that be after Promise Creek?" "I was headed to Fort Benton," Xavier replied, "but I'm reconsidering that plan." Martha's eyebrows rose. "Oh, what's changed your mind?" Xavier's gaze shifted to Winifred for a brief moment. "I've received word that there might be work closer to here over at the Rocking H Ranch. They're looking to improve their stock." "The Hendersons' place," Martha nodded. "About 20 miles west." "Not exactly closer to here for a man who travels hundreds of miles regularly." Xavier smiled, acknowledging the point. "Close enough to ride into town occasionally, though." Martha set down her coffee cup with a decisive click. "Mr. Blackwell, I'll speak plainly. My niece has had enough disappointment in her life without adding a man who can't decide whether he's coming or going. If you're interested in Winifred, state your intentions clearly. If not, kindly don't raise hopes that you have no intention of fulfilling." "Aunt Martha." Winifred's face burned with mortification. "That's enough." Xavier raised a hand. "It's a fair question, Miss Kennedy." He turned to Martha, his expression serious. "Mrs. Kennedy, I respect your concern for your niece. You're right that I've lived a rootless life until now, but I find myself intrigued by Promise Creek, or at least by one of its residents. I'd like the opportunity to get to know your niece better, to see if there might be something worth changing my ways for." Martha studied him for a long moment before nodding once. "Honesty, at least. I appreciate that." She stood, gathering the empty coffee cups. "Winifred, why don't you show Mr. Blackwell the garden while I tidy up here?" It was as close to a blessing as Martha was likely to give. Winifred led Xavier outside to the small plot behind the house where vegetables and a few flowers struggled against the Montana sun. "I apologize for my aunt," Winifred said once they were alone. "She means well, but she can be rather direct." Xavier laughed. "I meant what I said about appreciating directness, and she's right to be protective of you." They walked slowly along the narrow garden path, the afternoon sun warm on their shoulders. A light breeze carried the scent of earth and growing things, mingled with the ever-present dust of the prairie. "Is it true?" Winifred asked after a moment. "About the job at the Rocking H," Xavier nodded. "I heard about it yesterday from Peterson. He mentioned they're looking to bring in some thoroughbred stock to improve their horses. It's the kind of work I do well." "And is that why you're considering it? Because of the work?" Xavier stopped walking, turning to face her. "You know it isn't." Winifred looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of insincerity. "We barely know each other, Xavier. One evening of conversation, and a dance hardly seems reason enough to change your entire life." "Maybe not," he agreed. "But it's reason enough to want to know more. To see if what I felt last night, what I'm feeling right now, could grow into something worth staying for." He reached out, hesitantly touching her cheek with calloused fingers. "I'm not asking for promises, Winifred, just for time. Time to see what might develop between us." Winifred leaned slightly into his touch, her heart racing. "And if nothing does?" "Then I'll have spent time in the company of a remarkable woman, and I'll leave Promise Creek a better man for having known you." His voice was low, sincere. "But I think we both know there's already something here worth exploring." Before Winifred could respond, the back door opened, and Martha appeared. "If you two are finished with your garden tour, there's fresh coffee inside," she called, her tone making it clear that it wasn't really a suggestion. Xavier dropped his hand reluctantly. "Your aunt has impeccable timing," he murmured. Winifred smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. "She's been practicing for decades." They returned to the house for coffee, during which Martha quizzed Xavier further about his family background, his financial situation, and his views on everything from politics to religion. To his credit, Xavier answered each question thoughtfully, neither becoming defensive nor trying to charm his way out of the interrogation. When he finally rose to leave, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon. "Thank you for your hospitality, Mrs. Kennedy," he said, shaking Martha's hand firmly. "And for the excellent meal." Martha nodded, her expression softening slightly. "You're welcome to join us again before you make your decision about the rocking H, Mr. Blackwell. I'd like that very much." Xavier turned to Winifred. "Would it be presumptuous to ask if I might call on you tomorrow evening? I need to speak with the Hendersons during the day, but I could return by supper time." "Not presumptuous at all," Winifred replied, ignoring the knowing look Martha shot her. "Until tomorrow, then." Xavier placed his hat on his head and stepped out into the fading light. Winifred watched from the doorway as he walked away, his tall figure silhouetted against the golden evening sky. Only when he had disappeared from view did she close the door, turning to face her aunt's penetrating gaze. "Well," Martha said, arms crossed, "it seems you've made quite an impression on our Mr. Blackwell." "He's not our Mr. Blackwell," Winifred protested weakly. "Not yet, perhaps." Martha's expression was unreadable. "Just remember what I said about men who wander, Winifred. The heart is easily broken and slow to mend." With that cryptic warning, Martha retreated to her rocking chair by the window, leaving Winifred to ponder the rapid changes in her once predictable life. The following morning brought clouds and the distant rumble of thunder. Winifred woke early, as was her custom on laundry days, and found Martha already in the yard, assessing the sky with a practiced eye. "We'll need to work quickly," Martha declared. "Storms coming in from the west. Might hold off until afternoon, might not." They set to work, hauling water to fill the large copper washpots, building fires beneath them, and sorting the town's laundry into piles. It was hard physical labor, but Winifred was accustomed to it after 3 years of assisting her aunt. Her hands were red and chapped from lye soap, her back perpetually sore from bending over washtubs, but she never complained. The laundry business provided their living, modest though it was. As they worked, Winifred found her thoughts straying repeatedly to Xavier. Would he truly consider staying in Promise Creek? And if he did, what would that mean for her? She had never allowed herself to imagine a future beyond helping Aunt Martha with the laundry, perhaps eventually taking over the business when Martha became too old to manage it. The possibility of something different, something that included a man who looked at her with warmth rather than pity, was both exhilarating and terrifying. "You're wool-gathering again," Martha observed as Winifred paused in her scrubbing. "That's the same shirt you've been working on for 10 minutes. Winifred flushed, returning her attention to the stubborn collar stain. "Sorry, Aunt Martha," Martha sighed, wiping her forehead with the back of her arm. "I was young once too, you know. I understand the appeal of a handsome face and fine words. Just don't let them cloud your judgment." "Did you ever?" Winifred hesitated, unsure how to phrase the question. Martha rarely spoke of her past, and Winifred had learned not to pry. "Did you ever have someone special?" Martha was quiet for so long that Winifred thought she wouldn't answer. Then, to her surprise, a small, sad smile crossed her aunt's weathered face. "Once," Martha said softly. "His name was Edward. He worked for the railroad building the lines west. He had plans to save enough money to buy land, start a cattle ranch." She shook her head. "He died in a blasting accident before we could marry. I was 22. Winifred stared at her aunt, seeing her in a new light. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know." "No reason you should have." Martha resumed her washing with renewed vigor. "It was a long time ago. But I learned then that life doesn't always follow the path you expect. Sometimes it's kinder than you deserve, sometimes crueler. The trick is to face it squarely, whatever comes." They worked in silence after that, each lost in her own thoughts as they raced to finish the laundry before the storm broke. By midday, sheets and shirts hung on the lines stretched across the yard, billowing in the strengthening wind. They had just brought in the last of the dry laundry when the first fat raindrops began to fall. Within minutes, the shower had become a downpour, drumming on the roof and turning the dusty yard to mud. "Well, that's that," Martha declared, closing the door against the deluge. "No more work today. You might as well rest until it's time to prepare supper. Your young man will likely be delayed by this weather." "He's not my young man," Winifred protested automatically, though the words lacked conviction. Martha merely raised an eyebrow before retreating to her bedroom for her customary afternoon nap. Left alone, Winifred settled in the small parlor with her mending basket. As she stitched, she listened to the rain and wondered where Xavier was at that moment. Had he reached the rocking H before the storm? Or was he caught somewhere on the open prairie, seeking shelter beneath one of the few trees that dotted the landscape? The thought of him out in the elements filled her with an unexpected anxiety. She had known him barely 2 days, yet already his welfare mattered to her more than she cared to admit. The afternoon stretched on, the storm showing no signs of abating. By the time Martha emerged from her room, the light was growing dim despite the early hour, and Winifred had lit the lamps. "Doesn't look like your caller will make it through this weather," Martha observed as she peered out the window at the flooded yard. Winifred tried to hide her disappointment. "No, I suppose not." They prepared a simple supper of bean soup and cornbread, eating in companionable silence as the rain continued to pour. Winifred was just clearing the dishes when a knock came at the door, 3 sharp raps that barely carried over the sound of the storm. Martha and Winifred exchanged surprised glances. Who would be out in this? Martha wondered, rising to answer. When she opened the door, Xavier stood on the threshold, rain streaming from his hat and coat. Despite his drenched appearance, he smiled as he caught sight of Winifred. "Good evening, Mrs. Kennedy. Miss Kennedy, I apologize for my condition, but I promised to call tonight." "For heaven's sake, come in before you catch your death," Martha ordered, stepping back to admit him. "Winifred, fetch a towel and some of your father's old clothes. They might fit Mr. Blackwell well enough until his own dry out." Winifred hurried to comply, returning with a towel and a set of clothes that had belonged to her father, carefully preserved by Martha after her brother's death. Xavier accepted them gratefully, and Martha directed him to the small room off the kitchen where he could change. When he returned, his wet clothes draped over his arm, he looked somewhat comical in the too short pants and tight-fitting shirt. But his smile was warm as he handed the sodden bundle to Martha. "Thank you, madam. I appreciate your hospitality, especially given my unexpected state." Martha took the wet clothes with a shake of her head. "I'll hang these by the stove. Sit down and have some soup before you catch a chill." As Martha bustled away, Xavier turned to Winifred. "I hope I'm not imposing." "Not at all," she assured him, gesturing toward the table. "Though I'm surprised you ventured out in this weather. The rocking H is a good 20 miles from here." 23, Xavier corrected as he sat down. "And worth every mile of the journey." Winifred felt her cheeks warm as she ladled soup into a bowl for him. "Did you speak with Mr. Henderson about the job?" Xavier nodded, breaking off a piece of cornbread. "I did. He's interested in having me select some breeding stock for him and help train his ranch hands in proper handling. It would be steady work for at least 6 months, possibly longer." "And you're considering it?" Winifred tried to keep her voice neutral as she sat across from him. "I've accepted it," Xavier said simply. "I start next week." Winifred stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "But your plans to continue north have changed." Xavier reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "I told you yesterday that I wanted time to see what might develop between us. This job gives me that time, without any pressure on either of us." 6 months is a long time to stay in one place for a man used to wandering, Winifred observed, though her heart was racing at his touch. It is, Xavier agreed, but some things are worth changing for. Martha returned before Winifred could respond, carrying a steaming cup of coffee for their guest. If she noticed their clasped hands, she gave no indication. "The rain's not letting up," she announced, placing the cup before Xavier. "You'll have to stay the night, Mr. Blackwell. The spare room is small, but it's dry." Xavier withdrew his hand from Winifred's, accepting the coffee with a nod of thanks. "You're very kind, Mrs. Kennedy. I wouldn't want to impose further." "It's not kindness, it's common sense," Martha replied briskly. "Only a fool would set out in this weather, and you don't strike me as a fool." Xavier chuckled. "I try not to be, madam." With the matter settled, they passed the evening in the small parlor, the rain providing a soothing backdrop to their conversation. Xavier told stories of his travels, of the majestic landscapes he'd seen, the interesting characters he'd encountered, the horses he'd trained and sold. Winifred found herself entranced not just by the tales themselves, but by the way he told them with humor and insight, never boasting but clearly proud of his experiences. Even Martha seemed captivated, asking questions about places she'd never seen and likely never would. There was a wistfulness in her expression that Winifred had rarely observed, a hint of the young woman who might once have dreamed of adventure before life confined her to Promise Creek. As the evening wore on, Martha eventually excused herself, citing her early rising habits. "Winifred, show Mr. Blackwell to the spare room when you're ready to retire," she instructed. "And don't stay up too late. Rain or no, we have work tomorrow." After Martha had gone, a new awareness settled between Winifred and Xavier. Alone together in the lamplight, with the rain tapping against the windows, the small parlor seemed both more intimate and more fraught with unspoken possibilities. "Your aunt is quite a character," Xavier observed, breaking the momentary silence. Winifred smiled. "She is. Life hasn't been easy for her, but she's never let it break her spirit." "I see the same strength in you," Xavier said quietly. "The way you hold your head high despite the town's whispers, the way you don't let your leg define who you are." "I haven't always been so strong," Winifred admitted. "When I first came to Promise Creek after my parents died, I wanted nothing more than to disappear. The stares, the whispers, the pity, they were almost unbearable." "What changed?" Winifred considered the question. "I suppose I realized that hiding wouldn't make my leg heal or stop the gossip. And Martha, for all her gruffness, taught me that there's dignity in doing what needs to be done, regardless of circumstances." Xavier leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Tell me about your dream, the bakery you mentioned." Surprised that he remembered, Winifred felt a flush of pleasure. "It's just a fancy, really. I've always loved baking, creating something that brings joy to others. Before my parents died, my mother encouraged me to think about opening my own shop someday. She said my pies could make a fortune in the right location. Why not here in Promise Creek?" Winifred laughed softly. "In case you haven't noticed, Promise Creek isn't exactly welcoming to those who are different, and starting a business requires money that I don't have." "The town's opinion can change," Xavier pointed out, "especially if given reason to. As for money, well, good partnerships can solve many problems." "Partnerships?" Xavier smiled enigmatically. "Just a thought. But I've learned in my travels that opportunities arise in unexpected places for those willing to recognize them." They talked late into the night, their voices gradually softening as weariness overtook them. When Winifred finally showed Xavier to the tiny spare room, barely large enough for the narrow bed it contained, she found herself reluctant to say good night. "Thank you," she said, lingering in the doorway. for coming tonight despite the storm, for accepting the job at the Rocking H, for seeing me when so many others look past. Xavier stepped closer, his tall frame filling the small space between them. Winifred, he said softly, her name like a caress on his lips. I would have ridden through worse than a rainstorm to keep my promise to you. He reached up, his fingers brushing a strand of hair from her cheek, the touch feather light yet sending sparks through her entire body. For a breathless moment, Winifred thought he might kiss her, and found herself both hoping for and fearing that possibility. Instead, Xavier stepped back, respect clear in his eyes. "Good night, Miss Kennedy, sweet dreams." "Good night, Mr. Blackwell," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Until morning." As she made her way to her own room, Winifred felt as though she were floating, her feet barely touching the worn floorboards. For the first time in years, perhaps for the first time ever, she allowed herself to imagine a future filled with possibility rather than resignation. It was a dangerous feeling, this hope that Xavier had kindled within her, but tonight, with the rain singing its lullaby against the roof, she embraced it fully. The days that followed took on a rhythm unlike any Winifred had known in Promise Creek. Xavier departed the morning after the storm, riding to the Rocking H to begin his new position. But he returned to town regularly, sometimes with legitimate business at the mercantile or the blacksmith's, sometimes with transparent excuses that fooled no one, least of all Martha. Each visit included time spent with Winifred, walks along the creek that gave the town its name, Sunday dinners at Martha's table, occasional suppers at the small hotel restaurant that served as Promise Creek's only eating establishment. Gradually, the townspeople grew accustomed to seeing them together, though the whispers never entirely ceased. "They're saying he must owe you a debt," Prudence Miller informed Winifred one afternoon as she collected the Miller family's laundered shirts. "Or that there's something wrong with his eyesight. No normal man would court a cripple otherwise." Winifred, who once would have flinched at such words, merely smiled. "How fortunate, then, that Mr. Blackwell is far from normal, Mrs. Miller. He's extraordinary." The look of surprise on Prudence's face was worth every cruel word the woman had ever spoken. As summer gave way to autumn, Winifred found herself blooming like the prairie wildflowers after a rare rain. Xavier's attention, his genuine interest in her thoughts and dreams, his unwavering respect for her despite, or perhaps because of her differences, awakened parts of her she had long since buried. She laughed more easily, held herself with greater confidence, and even began to hum as she worked a habit that brought a knowing smile to Martha's weathered face. For his part, Xavier seemed equally transformed by their growing relationship. The restlessness that had marked him as a drifter gradually eased, replaced by a contentment that was evident in his relaxed posture and ready smile. He spoke less of the places he had been, and more of the life he was building at the Rocking H, the horses he was training, the improvements he was making to the stock, the respect he was earning from the ranch hands who had initially viewed him with suspicion. It was on a crisp October evening, with the first hint of winter in the air, that Xavier arrived at Martha's door with an unusual request. "I'd like to take Winifred to the harvest dance next Saturday," he said, after declining Martha's offer of coffee. "With your permission, of course." Martha's eyebrows rose. The harvest dance at the town hall, the same place where people laughed at her last time. Xavier nodded, his expression serious. "The very same, only this time things will be different." Martha studied him for a long moment before turning to Winifred, who had been listening from her seat by the fire. "What do you think, girl? Are you ready to face those gossips again?" Winifred considered the question carefully. The memory of her last public dance of Xavier leading her onto the floor while others stared and whispered was both sweet and painful. Sweet because of his kindness, painful because of the town's reaction. But much had changed since that July evening. "Yes," she said finally. "I believe I am." Martha nodded, satisfied. "Then you have my permission, Mr. Blackwell, though I suspect you would have taken her regardless of my answer." Xavier grinned, not bothering to deny the accusation. "Thank you, Mrs. Kennedy. I promise to have her home at a reasonable hour." "See that you do," Martha replied sternly, though there was a gleam of approval in her eyes. "And Winifred, you'll need a new dress for the occasion. That blue calico has seen better days." The week that followed was a flurry of preparation. Martha, displaying unexpected enthusiasm for the project, helped Winifred select fabric from the mercantile, a rich burgundy that complemented her auburn hair, and worked alongside her to create a dress more fashionable than anything Winifred had owned before. The bodice was fitted, the sleeves puffed at the shoulders in the current style, and the skirt full enough to move gracefully when she danced. "You look like your mother," Martha said softly when Winifred tried on the completed dress the day before the dance. "She always did have a way of lighting up a room just as you do when you smile." The compliment, so unexpected from her usually taciturn aunt, brought tears to Winifred's eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, embracing the older woman impulsively, "for everything." Martha returned the embrace briefly before stepping back, clearing her throat. "Yes, well, let's not get sentimental. There's still work to be done before tomorrow night." The evening of the harvest dance arrived clear and cool, with stars scattered across the darkening sky like diamonds on velvet. Xavier appeared at Martha's door precisely at 7 o'clock. Dressed in clothes Winifred had never seen before: a crisp white shirt, black trousers, and a well-cut jacket that emphasized his broad shoulders. "You look beautiful," he said simply when Winifred emerged from her room in the burgundy dress, her hair arranged in soft curls around her face. "As do you," she replied, admiring the transformation from trail-worn cowboy to polished gentleman. "I hardly recognized you without dust on your boots." Xavier laughed, offering his arm. "I clean up well when properly motivated." Martha watched their exchange with a mixture of satisfaction and concern. "Remember what I said about reputations, Mr. Blackwell. I expect my niece to be treated with the utmost respect." "Always, Mrs. Kennedy," Xavier assured her solemnly. "You have my word." The walk to the town hall was short but momentous for Winifred. Each step brought them closer to a public declaration of sorts, Xavier escorting her to the most significant social event of the season, for all of Promise Creek to see. Despite her newfound confidence, a flutter of anxiety stirred in her stomach. "Nervous?" Xavier asked softly, sensing her tension. "A little," Winifred admitted. "The last time we danced, not everyone was supportive of your choice of partner." Xavier squeezed her hand where it rested on his arm. "Let them talk. Tonight isn't about them, it's about us." The town hall was transformed for the harvest celebration. Corn stalks and autumn leaves decorated the walls. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting a golden glow over the proceedings, and tables laden with food lined one side of the room. The same small band that had played at the Founders' Day dance occupied the corner, though tonight they seemed more enthusiastic, perhaps buoyed by the festive atmosphere. As Winifred and Xavier entered, a momentary hush fell over the crowd, followed by a buzz of whispers. Winifred held her head high, grateful for Xavier's steadying presence beside her. Mayor Tilson approached them, his wife trailing behind. "Mr. Blackwell," he greeted Xavier with a handshake. "Good to see you again. And Miss Kennedy, you look lovely this evening." The compliment, coming from a man who had barely acknowledged her existence for 3 years, took Winifred by surprise. "Thank you, Mayor Tilson. Henderson tells me you've worked wonders with his horse stock," the mayor continued, addressing Xavier. "Says his yearlings are the finest in the territory now, thanks to your expertise." Xavier inclined his head modestly. "Mr. Henderson gives me too much credit. He had good stock to begin with, I just helped refine it." "Well, we're glad to have you in the area," Mrs. Tilson interjected, her gaze darting between Xavier and Winifred with undisguised curiosity. "Promise Creek can always use men of quality." After the Tilsons moved on to greet other guests, Xavier leaned down to murmur in Winifred's ear. "That wasn't so terrible, was it?" "Surprisingly not," she agreed. "Though I suspect Mrs. Tilson will be adding fresh fuel to the gossip mill tomorrow." "Let her," Xavier replied with a grin. "By then we'll have given them something worthwhile to talk about." Before Winifred could ask what he meant, the band struck up a lively tune and couples began to move toward the center of the room. "Shall we?" Xavier extended his hand, his eyes warm with invitation. Winifred hesitated only briefly before placing her hand in his. "We shall." As before, Xavier led her to the edge of the dance floor, positioning himself to accommodate her uneven gait. But unlike their first dance, Winifred moved with greater confidence, trusting Xavier to guide her through the steps. The hours of practice they had shared during his visits in Martha's small parlor with no music, but their own counting had given her a newfound assurance in her ability to follow his lead. They danced the first set, then another, and another after that. Between dances, Xavier introduced Winifred to people he had met through his work, ranchers and their wives who greeted her with genuine warmth, seeing her through Xavier's appreciative eyes rather than through the lens of her disability. Even some of the townspeople who had previously avoided her now approached with tentative overtures of friendship. Mrs. Reynolds, the blacksmith's wife, complimented Winifred's dress and asked for her apple pie recipe. Young Thomas Reid, chastened by his confrontation with Xavier months earlier, offered a stiff but sincere apology for his past behavior. Only Prudence Miller and her closest circle maintained their distance, watching from the corner with pinched expressions that spoke volumes about their disapproval. "Don't look now," Xavier murmured as they paused for refreshments, "but I believe Mrs. Miller is attempting to turn us to stone with her glare." Winifred smiled, taking a sip of punch. "She's had plenty of practice. I'm surprised we haven't crumbled to dust already." Xavier laughed, the sound drawing glances from nearby dancers. "Your sense of humor is one of the many things I adore about you, Winifred Kennedy." The casual declaration of affection warmed Winifred more than the punch ever could. "Is that so, Mr. Blackwell? And what other qualities have earned your admiration?" "Your strength," he replied without hesitation. "Your kindness. The way you see beauty in simple things. The fact that despite everything this town has put you through, you've never become bitter or cruel in return." Winifred blushed under his earnest gaze. "You make me sound like a saint. I assure you I've had my moments of resentment." "As has anyone with sense," Xavier acknowledged. "But you've never let it define you. That takes a special kind of courage." Before Winifred could respond, the band began a new tune slower and more melodic than their previous selections. "I believe this is a waltz," Xavier observed, setting aside his empty cup. "May I have this dance, Miss Kennedy?" Winifred placed her hand in his once more. "You may indeed, Mr. Blackwell." This time, Xavier led her not to the edge but to the center of the floor. Winifred faltered momentarily, uncertain about being so prominently displayed, but Xavier's reassuring smile steadied her. As they began to move to the music, Other couples stepped back slightly, creating space for them in an unconscious acknowledgement of their presence. "Everyone's watching," Winifred whispered, though she kept her head high. "Let them," Xavier replied softly. "Let them see what I see when I look at you, the most beautiful woman in Promise Creek." They waltzed beneath the lantern light, their movements in perfect harmony despite Winifred's uneven gait. Xavier guided her with such skill that her limp seemed to disappear into the rhythm of the dance, becoming simply another element of their unique pattern across the floor. As the music swelled, Xavier drew her closer, their bodies moving as one. In that moment, surrounded by the people who had once laughed at her, Winifred felt not shame but triumph. She was dancing, truly dancing with a man who saw beyond her imperfection to the woman beneath. When the waltz ended, the crowd erupted in spontaneous applause. Startled, Winifred looked around to discover that most of the other dancers had stopped to watch them, their faces reflecting not mockery but appreciation for the grace Xavier had helped her find. Even Prudence Miller, standing at the edge of the room with arms crossed, seemed unable to summon her usual disdain. Xavier bowed slightly, acknowledging the applause with a nod before leading Winifred toward the doors that opened onto the town hall steps. "I think we could both use some air," he suggested, noting the flush in her cheeks. Outside, the night was crisp and clear, the stars brilliant overhead. A few couples strolled along the street, enjoying the cooler air, but the steps themselves were unoccupied. Xavier guided Winifred to the same spot where they had sat on the night of the Founders' Day dance, the place where their story had truly begun. "You remember the first time we sat here?" he asked, his voice low in the darkness. Winifred nodded. "How could I forget? You defended my honor against Thomas Reid and told me about your Cherokee mother. That was the night I knew I couldn't simply ride away from Promise Creek as I'd planned," Xavier admitted. "Something about you, your strength, your quiet dignity called to me in a way I couldn't ignore." He turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "Winifred, these past months have been the happiest of my life. For years I've wandered, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. But with you, I've found something I never knew I was searching for, a home." Winifred's heart pounded so loudly she was certain Xavier must hear it. "Xavier, please let me finish," he said gently. "I know it hasn't been a long courtship by most standards, and perhaps this is too soon, too sudden. But I've lived enough to recognize truth when I find it, and the truth is that I love you, Winifred Kennedy. I love your strength and your gentleness, your humor and your compassion. I love the way you faced a world that often treated you unkindly without letting it harden your heart." He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, withdrawing a small velvet pouch. "I've been carrying this for weeks, waiting for the right moment. I think perhaps this is it." From the pouch, Xavier extracted a ring, a simple gold band set with a small but perfect sapphire that caught the starlight. "This belonged to my mother. My father gave it to her as a promise that he would always see her for who she truly was, not merely what others perceived. I can think of no better symbol for what I feel for you." He held the ring between them, his expression earnest in the dim light spilling from the town hall windows. "Winifred Kennedy, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? Of building a life with me here in Promise Creek or wherever else our journey might take us?" Winifred stared at the ring, then at Xavier's face, hardly daring to believe that this moment was real. "You want to marry me?" "Truly, more than I've ever wanted anything," Xavier assured her. "Say yes, Winifred. Say you'll be my partner, my equal, my love for all the days to come." Tears welled in Winifred's eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, Xavier Blackwell, I will marry you." Xavier slipped the ring onto her finger, where it fit as though made for her. Then he cupped her face gently between his hands and kissed her a sweet, tender kiss that promised a lifetime of understanding and affection. When they finally parted, Winifred was breathless with happiness. "I never imagined this," she admitted, "that someone would see past my limp to love the woman beneath." "Your limp is part of who you are," Xavier said softly, "but it doesn't define you any more than my mixed heritage defines me. We are more than the labels others assign us, Winifred. Together, we'll remind each other of that truth every day." The music from inside the town hall drifted out to them, a joyful tune that seemed to celebrate their newfound commitment. Xavier stood, offering his hand. "Shall we go back inside and share our news? Or would you prefer to keep it between us for now?" Winifred considered the question, then smiled. "Let's tell them, all of them, even Prudence Miller," Xavier laughed, helping her to her feet. "Especially Prudence Miller. Her expression alone will be worth the price of admission." Hand in hand, they returned to the dance, their happiness so evident that several people remarked on it before they had even announced their engagement. When Mayor Tilson called for silence to make a toast to the harvest, Xavier seized the opportunity to step forward, drawing Winifred with him. "If I might have a moment, Mayor," he requested. "I have an announcement to make." The mayor, slightly surprised but amenable, gestured for Xavier to continue. The room fell silent as Xavier turned to face the gathered townspeople, his hand firmly clasping Winifred's. "Friends and neighbors," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. "Some of you have known Miss Kennedy for years. Others, like myself, have had the privilege of meeting her more recently. But I stand before you tonight as the most fortunate man in Promise Creek, because this extraordinary woman has agreed to become my wife." A murmur ran through the crowd, followed by a smattering of applause that quickly grew in volume. Mayor Tilson stepped forward, raising his glass. "To Mr. Blackwell and Miss Kennedy," he proclaimed, "may your union be blessed with happiness and prosperity." "To Mr. Blackwell and Miss Kennedy," the crowd echoed, raising their glasses in toast. As congratulations poured in from all sides, Winifred caught sight of Prudence Miller standing near the refreshment table. For once, the woman seemed at a loss for words, her perpetual expression of disapproval replaced by something approaching bewilderment. "I think you've finally rendered Mrs. Miller speechless," Winifred murmured to Xavier as they accepted the good wishes of the Hendersons. "A feat many have attempted but none have achieved until now." Xavier followed her gaze and chuckled. "Perhaps we should invite her to the wedding. The shock might improve her disposition." The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of congratulations and well wishes. Even those who had previously ignored Winifred now approached with smiles and kind words, drawn by Xavier's obvious devotion, and perhaps by the realization that they had misjudged the quiet woman with the limp. By the time Xavier escorted Winifred home, the news of their engagement had spread throughout the hall and would undoubtedly reach every corner of Promise Creek by morning. Martha was waiting for them, a knowing gleam in her eyes as she took in Winifred's radiant expression and the sapphire ring on her finger. "So he finally asked," she observed, ushering them inside. "Took him long enough. I was beginning to think he'd lost his nerve." Xavier laughed, removing his hat. "You knew my intentions, Mrs. Kennedy." "I'm old, not blind," Martha retorted. "You've been carrying that ring for weeks. I've seen you patting your pocket like a man checking for a missing tooth." Winifred looked between them in surprise. "You knew he was going to propose. He asked for my blessing last Sunday," Martha admitted. "I told him he'd better make an honest woman of you after all the tongues he'd set wagging in town." "Aunt Martha," Winifred exclaimed, scandalized. "What? It's the truth." Martha's stern expression softened as she looked at her niece. "Though I also told him he'd be getting the best wife a man could ask for if you accepted him." Winifred crossed the room to embrace her aunt, touched by the rare display of affection. "Thank you," she whispered. Martha patted her back awkwardly before stepping away. "Yes, well, no need for all this emotion. You two sit down and tell me about the dance while I make some tea. I want to hear how Prudence Miller took the news." As they settled in the small parlor, recounting the events of the evening for Martha's benefit, Winifred felt a sense of completeness she had never known before. The ring on her finger caught the lamplight, sending small blue flashes across the room, reminders of the unexpected joy that had come into her life when a stranger had asked her to dance, despite the town's laughter. In the months that followed, Promise Creek witnessed a transformation not just in the relationship between Xavier Blackwell and Winifred Kennedy, but in the town's attitude toward the woman they had once marginalized. As preparations for the wedding progressed, many who had previously avoided Winifred now sought her company, perhaps seeing her through new eyes or simply drawn by Xavier's obvious adoration. Martha, for her part, took charge of the wedding arrangements with unexpected enthusiasm, revealing a talent for organization that surprised even Winifred. The ceremony was set for early December, before the worst of the winter weather made travel difficult for the guests Xavier invited from neighboring territories. "Not a large wedding," Martha decreed, "but a proper one. You'll be married in the church, with Reverend Simmons officiating, and there will be a reception at the town hall afterward." Winifred, who had imagined a simple ceremony with just a few witnesses, found herself swept along by her aunt's determination. "Whatever you think best, Aunt Martha." "And you'll need a proper wedding dress," Martha continued. "Not just another Sunday best. I've been setting aside some money for years. My gift to you will be the fabric from Denver. Mrs. Reynolds is a fine seamstress. She's agreed to help with the sewing." The mention of Mrs. Reynolds, who had barely acknowledged Winifred's existence before the harvest dance, was yet another indication of how much had changed. The blacksmith's wife had become one of Winifred's most vocal supporters, going so far as to reprimand Prudence Miller publicly when the latter made a disparaging remark about the upcoming nuptials. Even more surprising was the day Winifred returned from delivering clean laundry to find Xavier deep in conversation with Martha at the kitchen table, a collection of papers spread between them. "What's all this?" she asked, removing her shawl. Xavier stood to greet her with a kiss on the cheek. "Your aunt and I have been discussing a business proposition." Winifred looked between them, puzzled. "What sort of proposition?" Martha gestured for her to sit. "The Johnsons are selling their building on Main Street, the one next to the Mercantile. It's been empty since their dry goods store failed last year." "I remember," Winifred said cautiously, still not understanding the significance. Xavier pulled a chair out for her. "I've been thinking about your dream of opening a bakery." The Johnson building would be perfect, good location, large windows for display, and a decent-sized oven already installed from when they tried selling baked goods alongside their other merchandise. Winifred stared at him, then at Martha, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "You want to buy the Johnson building? For a bakery?" "For your bakery," Xavier corrected gently. "A wedding gift of sorts, though in practical terms it would be our business, a way to build something together that utilizes your talents. But the cost?" Winifred began, knowing that such a building on Main Street would command a substantial price. "Is manageable," Xavier assured her. "I've been saving most of my earnings for years. The life of a horse trader doesn't require much expenditure, and I've been fortunate in my dealings. Between my savings and what your aunt has put aside, We can purchase the building outright and still have enough for initial supplies and equipment." Martha nodded, her expression a mixture of pride and satisfaction. "I always told your mother you had a gift for baking. This way, all of Promise Creek will benefit from it and pay for the privilege." Winifred's mind raced with possibilities. Her own bakery, the dream she had mentioned to Xavier months ago, never expecting it to materialize. Fresh bread and pies, cakes for special occasions, perhaps even pastries like those she remembered from visits to Chicago as a child. "What about your work at the Rocking H?" she asked Xavier. "And Aunt Martha's laundry business?" "Henderson understands that my priorities are changing," Xavier explained. "He's offered me a position as a consultant less demanding than my current role, allowing me to divide my time between the ranch and the bakery. As for your aunt—" "I'm getting too old for laundry work," Martha interjected. "My hands ache in the cold and my back isn't what it was. I've been thinking of scaling back, focusing on just a few regular customers, or perhaps training someone younger to take over." She leaned forward, fixing Winifred with an earnest gaze. "This is your chance, girl. The opportunity your mother would have wanted for you. Don't let fear hold you back." Winifred looked from Martha to Xavier, overwhelmed by their belief in her. "I don't know what to say." Xavier took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm as he had done the night of their first dance. "Say yes. Say you'll build this dream with me, just as you've agreed to build a life with me." Tears welled in Winifred's eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes to all of it, the bakery, our future, everything." The wedding day dawned clear and cold, the December sky a flawless blue above Promise Creek. In Martha's small house, Winifred stood before the mirror in her bedroom, hardly recognizing the woman who gazed back at her. The wedding dress, crafted from ivory satin with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, transformed her from the laundress's niece into a bride of uncommon elegance. "You look beautiful," Martha said from the doorway, her voice unusually husky with emotion. "Your mother would be so proud of the woman you've become." Winifred turned, smiling through tears that threatened to spill. "I wish she could be here, and Father too. They are in their own way." Martha crossed the room, adjusting the small wreath of dried winter berries and evergreen that crowned Winifred's auburn curls. "I see them both in you, your father's determination, your mother's gentle heart." A knock at the front door signaled the arrival of Mr. Reynolds, who had volunteered to escort Winifred to the church in his wagon. Martha stepped back, giving Winifred a final appraising look. "Remember what I told you," she said firmly. "Walk with your head high. You're marrying the man you love today, and all of Promise Creek will witness your happiness." The small church was filled to capacity when Winifred arrived. Faces turned as she entered on Mr. Reynolds's arm, familiar faces that had once looked past her, but now smiled in genuine welcome. At the altar stood Xavier, more handsome than ever in a new black suit, his expression transforming from nervous anticipation to awe as he caught sight of her. The walk down the aisle was the longest Winifred had ever undertaken, each step bringing her closer to the future she had never dared to imagine. Her limp, once a source of shame, now seemed inconsequential compared to the joy that filled her heart. When she reached Xavier's side, he took her hand, squeezing it gently in reassurance. "You are breathtaking," he whispered before turning to face Reverend Simmons. The ceremony itself was simple but profound. They exchanged vows they had written themselves, promises not just of love and fidelity, but of partnership and understanding, of seeing each other always as they truly were rather than as others might perceive them. When Xavier slipped the gold band onto her finger to accompany the sapphire engagement ring, his hands were steady, his eyes never leaving hers. With this ring, I thee wed, he said clearly, and pledge to walk beside you through whatever paths life may lead us. Winifred's response was equally firm as she placed a matching band on his finger. With this ring, I thee wed and promise to be your partner, your equal, and your love for all the days of our lives. By the authority vested in me, Reverend Simmons proclaimed, I now pronounce you husband and wife. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder. He smiled at Xavier. You may kiss your bride. The kiss was tender, a promise sealed before the gathered witnesses. When they turned to face the congregation as Mr. and Mrs. Blackwell, the applause was spontaneous and heartfelt. The reception at the town hall lasted well into the evening, with food and music and dancing that reminded Winifred of that first Founders' Day celebration, where Xavier had asked her to dance despite the town's laughter. Now, as they waltzed together as husband and wife, the only sounds were those of approval and good wishes. Even Prudence Miller, who had attended the wedding with obvious reluctance, approached them during the festivities. I wish you happiness, Mrs. Blackwell, she said stiffly. Your husband is a fortunate man. Coming from Prudence, it was as close to an apology as one could expect. Winifred accepted it graciously. Thank you, Mrs. Miller. I consider myself equally fortunate. As the celebration continued around them, Xavier led Winifred to a quiet corner. Happy, Mrs. Blackwell? He asked, his eyes crinkling at the corners in the way she had come to love. More than I ever thought possible, she admitted, leaning into his embrace. Though I'm still getting used to the name. You wear it well, he assured her. Just as you wear everything else with grace and dignity. Winifred looked out at the gathered townspeople neighbors who had once whispered behind their hands at her approach, but now raised glasses in celebration of her marriage. It's strange how much has changed in just a few months. People can surprise you, Xavier observed. Sometimes in good ways if given the chance. You surprised me, Winifred said softly. That night when you asked me to dance when everyone else was laughing, you changed everything. Xavier shook his head, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. You changed everything, Winifred. I just had the good sense to recognize the extraordinary woman behind the limp that others couldn't see past. He glanced toward the door, then back at her with a mischievous smile. What would you say to making an early departure? I have one more surprise waiting for you. Curious, Winifred allowed him to make their excuses to Martha and the remaining guests. Outside, instead of the rented buggy that had brought them to the reception, a beautiful new wagon stood waiting, drawn by two of the finest horses from the Rocking H Ranch. What's this? Winifred asked, staring at the vehicle with its gleaming paint and comfortable-looking cushioned seat. Our wedding gift from Henderson and his wife, Xavier explained, helping her up. They thought we might appreciate transportation of our own, especially with the bakery opening next month. As he climbed up beside her and took the reins, Winifred realized they were heading not toward Martha's house, where they had planned to spend their wedding night before moving into rooms above the bakery once renovations were complete. Where are we going? She asked, noting that they were leaving the center of town behind. Xavier smiled mysteriously. One last surprise. Trust me, always, Winifred replied, settling against his side as the horses trotted steadily through the gathering dusk. They traveled for perhaps 15 minutes, following the road that led west out of Promise Creek. Just as Winifred was about to question their destination again, Xavier turned the wagon onto a smaller track that wound through a stand of cottonwood trees. Beyond the trees, a small cabin came into view, newly built from the look of the fresh-cut timber, with smoke curling invitingly from its chimney. A lantern hung beside the door, casting a welcoming glow into the deepening twilight. Xavier. Winifred breathed, understanding dawning. "What have you done?" He brought the wagon to a halt before the cabin. "I wanted us to have a place of our own somewhere between town and the rocking H, private but not isolated." He gestured to the surrounding landscape. "The land belonged to Henderson. He sold me 5 acres as a wedding present at a very favorable price." Jumping down from the wagon, Xavier came around to help Winifred descend. Instead of simply offering his hand, however, he lifted her into his arms, cradling her against his chest. "Xavier," she protested, laughing. "Put me down. I'm perfectly capable of walking." "I'm aware of your capabilities, Mrs. Blackwell," he replied, carrying her toward the cabin door. "But tradition demands that I carry my bride across the threshold of our first home together." Inside, the cabin was small but thoughtfully arranged. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting flickering light over simple but sturdy furniture. Winifred noted with delight the copper cookware hanging from hooks in the kitchen area, the colorful quilt spread across the bed in the corner, the bookshelves already filled with volumes she recognized from Xavier's saddlebags and others that were unfamiliar. "When did you do all this?" she asked as Xavier finally set her on her feet. "How did you keep it secret?" "I've been working on it for months, whenever I could get away from the ranch without raising suspicion," Xavier admitted. "Henderson helped, and some of the hands. Even Martha knew she helped with the furnishings and made sure the fire would be lit for our arrival tonight." Winifred moved through the space, touching the smooth wooden table, the comfortable-looking armchair by the fire, the curtains that framed the windows. "It's perfect," she whispered. "Absolutely perfect." Xavier came to stand behind her, his hands resting lightly on her shoulders. "We'll use the rooms above the bakery when we need to stay in town, but I thought you might appreciate having a real home, a place that's truly ours, built with love from the ground up." Winifred turned in his arms, overwhelmed by the thought and care he had put into creating this sanctuary for them. "I don't deserve you," she said softly. "You deserve everything," Xavier countered, drawing her closer. "Every happiness, every comfort, every dream fulfilled. And I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure you have them all." In the warm glow of the fire, on their wedding night in the home he had built with his own hands, Xavier kissed her, not the chaste kiss of their ceremony, but a deeper, more passionate embrace that spoke of the life they would build together, of the love that had begun when a town laughed at a woman with a limp, and a cowboy asked her to dance anyway. 5 years later, on a bright spring morning, Winifred Blackwell stood in the doorway of Kennedy's bakery, watching as her husband helped their 3-year-old daughter feed crumbs to the sparrows that gathered on the boardwalk. Little Sarah, with her father's dark hair and her mother's determined spirit, laughed delightedly as the birds hopped closer, eager for the treat. Inside the bakery, the counters were laden with fresh bread, pies cooling on racks, and cookies arranged in glass jars. The scent of cinnamon and sugar hung in the air, mingling with the yeasty aroma of rising dough. In the 5 years since its opening, Kennedy's had become not just a successful business, but a gathering place for the people of Promise Creek, a testament to how completely the town's perception of Winifred had changed. "Mama, look," Sarah called, pointing to a particularly bold sparrow that had perched on Xavier's outstretched finger. "Daddy made a friend." "I see that, sweetheart," Winifred replied, smiling at the picture they made her tall, handsome husband crouching beside their dark-haired daughter, both of them utterly absorbed in the moment. Xavier looked up, catching her eye across the distance. Even after 5 years of marriage, the love in his gaze still had the power to take her breath away. "Mrs. Henderson was asking after you," Martha said, emerging from the back room where she had been packaging special orders. At 70, she had finally relinquished the laundry business entirely, but she still helped at the bakery several days a week, her experience and practicality as valuable as ever. Said to tell you the bread you sent over for their anniversary celebration was the finest she's ever tasted. Winifred smiled, turning back to the warm interior of the shop. That's kind of her to say, though I suspect she might be trying to ensure a discount on her next order. Martha snorted, but there was affection in the sound. You're getting cynical in your old age, Winifred. Hardly old, Xavier commented as he entered with Sarah perched on his shoulders, though perhaps wiser than when I first met her. Wiser indeed, Martha agreed. She married you, didn't she? That showed excellent judgment. Xavier laughed, setting Sarah down carefully. I've always said your aunt is a woman of discernment, little one, he told his daughter solemnly. You would do well to listen to her advice. Sarah nodded, her expression serious beyond her years. Aunt Martha knows everything, she agreed. She told me so. Martha's lips twitched suspiciously. Did I now? Well, I suppose there's some truth to that. The bell above the door jingled as it opened, admitting Prudence Miller. 5 years had softened her somewhat, though she still carried herself with the same self-importance that had once made her the arbiter of Promise Creek's social hierarchy. Good morning, Winifred, she greeted, her gaze moving from Winifred to Xavier and Sarah. I see the whole family is here today. Good morning, Mrs. Miller, Winifred replied pleasantly. What can I help you with? I need a cake for my daughter's wedding, Prudence said, smoothing her gloves. Something elegant but not ostentatious. Ellen is marrying the new schoolteacher next month, you know. Yes, I'd heard, Winifred acknowledged, moving behind the counter to retrieve her order book. I'd be happy to create something special for the occasion. Did you have anything particular in mind? As they discussed designs and flavors, Xavier took Sarah to the back room to help Martha with the cookie cutters, a task that invariably resulted in more flour on the child than on the table, but one she adored nonetheless. When Prudence had finally departed, satisfied with the plans for her daughter's wedding cake, Winifred joined her family in the back room. Sarah sat on a stool, her small face serious with concentration, as she carefully pressed a star-shaped cutter into the rolled dough. Martha supervised, offering guidance when needed, but mostly allowing the child to work at her own pace. Xavier looked up from where he was stoking the oven fire. All settled with Mrs. Miller, as settled as one can be with Prudence, Winifred replied with a smile. Though she's mellowed considerably over the years. Amazing what a successful business and a happy marriage can accomplish, Xavier observed, crossing the room to stand beside her. Not to mention the most beautiful child in Montana. Winifred leaned against him, watching as Sarah proudly held up a slightly lopsided star cookie for Martha's inspection. She is rather wonderful, isn't she? Takes after her mother, Xavier murmured, his arm encircling Winifred's waist. Strong-willed, determined, and utterly enchanting. Winifred smiled, remembering the uncertain young woman she had been when Xavier first arrived in Promise Creek, the woman who had believed herself unworthy of love because of a limp that set her apart from others. How different her life was now, filled with purpose and joy and the family she had never dared to imagine. What are you thinking about? Xavier asked, noting her contemplative expression. About dancing, Winifred replied softly. About how one moment of courage, yours and mine, changed everything. Xavier's eyes crinkled at the corners, the way they always did when he smiled from the heart. Best decision I ever made, asking you to dance that night, even with the town laughing, especially then. He pressed a kiss to her temple. The look on your face when you realized I wasn't mocking you, that I genuinely wanted to dance with you, was worth every whisper, every stare. Sarah looked up from her cookie cutting, flour dusting her dark curls. "Daddy, will you teach me to dance too? Like you teached Mama." "Taught," Martha corrected automatically. "Your father taught your mother." "Taught," Sarah repeated dutifully. "Will you, Daddy?" Xavier crossed to his daughter, lifting her from the stool and into his arms. "I would be honored to teach you to dance, Miss Sarah. Though I should warn you your mother is a far better dancer than I could ever hope to be." "But Mama has a limp," Sarah pointed out with the straightforward honesty of childhood. "Mrs. Miller said that's why she walks funny." A brief silence fell over the room. Martha stiffened, her expression darkening, but Xavier merely nodded solemnly. "Your mother does have a limp," he agreed. "And Mrs. Miller is correct that it affects the way she walks. But what Mrs. Miller doesn't understand, what many people don't understand, is that true grace isn't about perfect steps. It's about the courage to take those steps at all, especially when they're difficult." He set Sarah down and crossed to Winifred, extending his hand just as he had that first night. "May I have this dance, Mrs. Blackwell?" Winifred placed her hand in his, her heart full. "Always, Mr. Blackwell." As they waltzed between the work tables, with no music but the rhythm of their hearts, Winifred caught sight of Martha watching them. Her usually stern face softened with emotion. Sarah clapped her hands in delight, her eyes wide with wonder at the sight of her parents dancing in the flour-dusted bakery. In that moment, surrounded by the family she had created and the life she had built, Winifred Kennedy Blackwell knew a happiness that transcended all the limitations others had once tried to place upon her. She was a wife, a mother, a successful businesswoman, and yes, a woman with a limp. But that last detail, once so defining in the eyes of Promise Creek, had become merely one facet of a life rich with love and purpose. The town that had once laughed at the woman with a limp had learned to see her as she truly was. And it had all begun with a dance, and the cowboy brave enough to ask for it.